Our first speaker today is Professor Warwick Mckibben. Warwick is the Director, Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis at the Australian National University. It's in the ANU College of Business and Economics, and he's also Adjunct Professor in the Australian Centre for Economic Research in Health at the ANU. Also, he is a Professorial Fellow at the Whitlam Institute for International Policy in Sydney, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC, where he is Co-Director of the Climate and Energy Economic Project. He is President of McKibbin Software Group, and he is a member of the Board of the Reserve Bank of Australia. He recently served as a member of the Australian Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council and on the Australian Prime Minister's Task Force on Uranium Mining, Processing and Nuclear Energy in Australia. Would you please welcome Warwick Mckibben.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey, and thank you also to the Whitlam Institute and the University of Western Sydney for asking me to present today. My role was to set the scene, so you could call this presentation Life, the Universe and Everything. And the answer actually isn't 42. The answer is 42 plus or minus 20. And you'll understand the meaning of that towards the end. What I wanted to do in talking about what are the challenges facing Australia is actually start looking at what the challenges are facing the world, because it's a big mistake for policymakers in small open economies to think that their focus is actually what's happening in their economy. What happens in the world really matters for what happens in Australia. There are wide ranges of challenges in the short term, in the medium term and in the long term. I will then burrow down and look at a couple of key challenges facing Australia. One of those is dealing with climate change, and another is how to deal with the massive shock coming towards us from an emergence of China and India into the global economy. Now, all of these shocks and all of the projections of the future I'll be talking about all involve, from an economist's point of view, substantial changes in relative prices. And the theme of how do you deal with policy responses when relative prices are changing in very, very large magnitudes is really the theme going through this presentation. To give you an example, the price of energy and resources is likely to be sharply rising while the price of manufacturing is falling. The price of money is likely to be changing dramatically over future years in different countries. The price of high-skilled labour versus low-skilled labour is likely to be changing substantially. There's a whole range of relative prices that policymakers need to deal with. Now, if you fall asleep from this point on, I just want to give you the punchline. And the punchline is that when you're designing policy, we should not think that the world is a deterministic place and that we know what the future will be when the future arrives. Policy has to be designed to deal with enormous uncertainty. Just look back the last decade and look from a decade ago what we imagined the world would look like today, and I can guarantee you would have pretty much got it wrong. So what's clear here is that policy has to be incredibly flexible, has to be well designed, institutions have to be designed to deal with the uncertainty, and there's several other key issues in policy design that I think we just haven't got right. So some fundamental questions that you have to think about over the next decades. Firstly, what is the role of the private sector versus the public sector? Do we prefer market failure or government failure? How do we create the incentives to guide individual actions, or do we just settle for command and control where the state knows better than the individual? When we regulate, do we have no regulation? Do we have bad regulation? Do we have optimal regulation? At the global institutional level, there's a big issue about do we want to have a centralised global government or do we want to coordinate national systems? Now, there are debates to be had across all of these philosophical issues, but these are the issues I think the globe is facing over coming years. And very importantly, and we've learnt this in the Australian context, we've learnt this in the international context, is that the institutions we build are incredibly important for a variety of reasons, but one of the key ones is to get rid of this populist economic short-termism that goes on in many economies. And so we have to be very careful. We've built the Productivity Commission, we've built the Reserve Bank, independent institutions. We need to do the same thing in the climate area and several other areas. What are the global challenges? And I'm not obviously going to talk about every single one, but I think it's worth laying out the main ones. Firstly, we have the North Atlantic financial crisis. And we have to worry about how do we recover from a crisis which is very asymmetric. The industrial countries, particularly North America and the UK, are in a very different state of the world than everybody else. How do we deal with global macroeconomic imbalances? Are they gone? They're a key part of the financial crisis. My view is that they're certainly not disappearing. Do we have to deal with these or not? How do we deal with what you could call the elephant in the room, which is probably a bad pun? But how do you deal with the elephant in the room, which is the emergence of China and India? We know this is important because we could see what was happening in the last 10 years to the relative price of energy and scarce resources relative to manufacturing. We know it's important because some people argue that the accumulation of trillions of dollars of foreign exchange reserves in China was one of the reasons why we ended up with the financial crisis that we saw in North America. So that's a very critical issue. Underlying this, over many decades ahead, there is a massive global demographic transition coming our way. Very different in very different in different regions of the world. China is very, very different than India, and I'll talk briefly about that. How do we deal with climate change, and how do we deal with the world's need for energy over coming decades? How do we deal with the economics, or how do we deal with infectious diseases? H1N1 is still very much in the news, still very high probability of a mutation in the North American winter. We have to have mechanisms in place. We have to invest in prevention in the poorest of poor countries to prevent this from being a major economic problem. How do we deal with managing water resources globally? How do we deal with governments reform, the international institutions, the financial architecture, the world trading system, foreign investment guidelines, the global environment? So that's a very small list of big issues, and I imagine each one of these questions, although it's a global question, there's an Australian analogue that goes with it, and the other speakers this afternoon will no doubt touch on this. What I want to do now is just pick off pieces, and actually I do usually have a view on things, and I want to pick off the pieces that I have a strong view of, lay out my view, and hopefully some other speakers will address that, or people from the audience later on. There are some big problems in the recovery, and we are in a recovery phase of the financial crisis. There are issues related to the monetary policy stance of the world. I should also mention that my remarks, I should have said this at the beginning, my remarks are personal and don't reflect the views of the Reserve Bank of Australia. We have to deal with fiscal policies in various countries, and we have to deal with trade policies. Now at the moment, we're backing away from a Doha round and countries are moving towards protectionist policies. We have to think about what that means. So what's the stance of global monetary policy? This is a very big problem because we have basically zero interest rates in major economies. This is a very distortionary policy. It's necessary given the macroeconomic situation that these countries face, but it's a situation that has to be unwound very, very quickly. Both for these economies, but also because many economies in the world are pegging to the US dollar. So the monetary policy in these countries, big developing countries, are the US monetary policy. So we have really a surge of growth in the developing countries, not affected badly by the financial crisis, these economies adopting the policies of a crisis economy. That is a recipe for a big problem down the road. In my view, there already is a global bubble in the making, and this has to be addressed very, very quickly by global monetary authorities. Just to give you an idea of just what the situation looks like, this is a picture of the Fed's balance sheet. This shows you the composition of assets as well as the change in assets when the crisis occurred. And the Fed normally has a balance sheet of around $1 trillion. That at the end of 2008, after the Lehman Brothers collapse, the Fed started buying agency securities, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, shares, all sorts of commercial paper. They actually started buying the private sector in the US, and you can see that the balance sheet of the Fed expanded dramatically to over $2 trillion. Now this situation is not sustainable. If this is not reversed, this is future inflation. And the question is, how does the Fed unwind the balance sheet without unnerving markets? This is not just a problem in the US, this shows you what's happening to credit growth in China. In the last quarter, credit growth in China was over 33% annualised. So we have a massive, massive surge of liquidity in China. This is not sustainable.